Hi, welcome to my channel. I'm going to be doing something a little bit different today and talk about growing up in a fundamentalist church. Full disclosure, my parents were not fundamentalists, but we did attend a fundamentalist church. Why that is, the church itself did not advertise as fundamentalist. I mean, a lot of them don't. But about half the families that attended were more modern, and then the other half were more, I would guess, at the time I would say old-fashioned, but other people would call them fundamentalists. There's a lot of talk online and in social media about fundies and everything. It's a huge hot topic right now, especially with Josh Duggar's recent arrest, or I guess he's only been arrested one time. And ever since the Duggars came on TV, fundamentalism has been discussed a lot. So I was inspired to make this video after seeing several videos about people who were fundamentalists, who grew up in fundamentalist homes or churches. I find it fascinating. I was somewhat involved in fundamentalism, but somewhat on the rim because my family were not fundamentalists, so they didn't raise us as fundamentalists, and they actually were and are still very wary of fundamentalists. So my intent for this video is not to make fun of churches or make fun of Christians or anything of that matter. And full disclosure, I am still a Christian, albeit a somewhat lukewarm Christian. I would consider myself a more modern Christian, I guess. I'm definitely not a fundamentalist. I don't believe a lot of the old-fashioned aspects in the Old Testament, because it was written 2,000 years ago. I still do attend church. I haven't in a couple years because of the massive stuff going around the world for the past 2 years. I think churches are back open, but I just haven't gone. We moved and everything. I have watched some online church services and everything, but I like to go to bigger churches, not necessarily mega churches, but bigger churches, because I am very wary of small churches and I'm still very suspect. I am a little bit wary of all churches actually, but I prefer larger churches because they have more resources and everything, and people I have found are less in your business to an extent. And I consider myself a non-denominational Christian. Yeah, I'm not a very strict Christian at all. So I've always been a non-denominational Christian. It just means you're not a Lutheran, a Baptist, Presbyterian, etc. Fun fact, my parents were actually non-denominational Christians as well. They still are, but my dad was raised mostly in a Presbyterian church. My mom was raised Lutheran. She was actually baptized as an infant, which is a huge no-no in Baptist churches. And we were raised in a Baptist church, my brother and I were, that my parents still attend. And it was a North American Baptist church, or NAB, which they don't have anything to do with the other Baptists, especially not the Southern Baptists. We would have youth group conferences sometimes, and we could only do joint youth group sessions with NAB churches or NAB youth groups, which was crazy because there were a couple other youth groups in the valley that we lived in that would have been a much shorter drive. I remember one time we drove 2 or 3 hours to go to an NAB youth conference, and it was like, why? And so over the past year, I've been writing down different memories from attending church. I honestly spent more time there than I ever did at school, and it was such a huge part of my childhood. It was probably other than being at home, it was the place where I spent the most time, obviously, because we did do AWANA, Sunday school. Obviously, my parents were very involved. My dad was a trustee and later a deacon in the church, and my mom, I think she taught Sunday school at one point, but she is and has been for the past few years a paid employee of the church. I just recently Googled their church, which has changed its name due to some controversy, or due to some sticky legal situations about 10 years ago. They changed the name of the church, rebranded it, fired the old pastor. Anyway, so I went on their church website, and my dad is listed. They're listed as a couple. They have all the couples listed, you know. Both spouses are involved in the church, right? So my dad is like they don't call it a church elder, but basically he is. We've been going to that church, or my family's been going to that church for 30 years. And it has this, this blurb about my dad, like an entire paragraph. And then it just briefly mentions my mom. I thought it was kind of funny because my mom is one of 3 paid employees at the church, and my dad is in what is essentially an unpaid position as a volunteer. So anyway, thought that was pretty interesting. I decided to make this video in order to bring attention to the former pastor who covered up multiple cases of domestic violence and child abuse, and his habit of victim blaming and taking credit for people's salvation. This is going to be a several-part series. I'm not sure how many videos I'll make on this, but there's so much to talk about. I mean, I have paragraphs upon paragraphs of notes on my phone that I've been writing down for the past year. There's just so much that happened and so many interesting things. You know, I've gone online and read Homeschoolers Anonymous, for example, and I was just really inspired to share my story after reading all their stories. So my experience at this church definitely left me a bit wounded about churches. It's led to a lot of trust issues with churches. The church has had to change its name from the original name it had for over 100 years due to a lawsuit and some other unwanted attention resulting from some inappropriate actions a youth pastor took. I'm sure you can guess what those are. That'll be a whole other video. There's so much to discuss there. The guy actually did get charged and everything and is a registered you know what, which hopefully Josh Duggar will be in a few months. I am planning on covering his trial. It's on November 30th. So NAB, interestingly enough, also has Canadian churches included in it. And our pastor was from Alberta, and he was eventually, I don't want to say deported there, but suspiciously removed from the United States. So although our church was a fundamentalist church, around half the families were fundamentalist, and then about the other half were more moderate or modern, if you want to call that. Some people would now call it progressive, but I would never call any of them progressive. And the same goes for homeschooling. So about half the families in our church homeschooled, especially in the early 90s, early to mid 90s. Half the families homeschooled, and then the other half went to public school. We did have onesies and twosies with the private school that was in the next town over, but it wasn't like a prep school or anything. This is, you know, rural, like hills and farm country and all this stuff, mountains, whatever. The next town over had farm country, but they had this little private school, and I don't think it was that cheap, but yeah, one or two people went there, mostly to play sports. So some of the kids homeschooled early in their education, like elementary school, and then they later attended public school and middle school and high school, which I think is the worst idea ever, because at least in elementary school, you're getting exposed to all this crap and you're slowly transitioning. Whereas like middle school is tough enough and high school is tough enough as it is. I can't imagine going from being homeschooled to going into middle school or high school and having no exposure to people like that or things like that. I know there's a lot of funny snark on people homeschooling. I honestly have no issue with homeschooling as long as you know what you're doing. Well, depending on the person that's conducting the homeschooling, who's doing the teaching. But I do think it can be beneficial in certain situations and in certain school districts. The public school system where I grew up was absolute garbage. The public schools were terrible. I honestly would have learned more from being homeschooled than I would from going to that craptastic school, elementary, middle, high school schools, I guess. But I mean, you could have learned more from reading a book. And my senior year, I was semi-homeschooled, but that's another story. I hated our public school. My nephews go there now, and I'm just like, ugh, I think it's still as bad as it ever was because they have a lot of the same teachers I had. One of them came home and was like, oh, my teacher said he knows you. And I'm like, anyway. So I really don't blame parents for homeschooling, especially in the past 2 years with everything going on. You know, kids were in school, then they were out, and they were partially in school, then they were on Zoom. Like, you can't learn anything on Zoom in elementary school. I'm sorry. Middle school, yeah. High school, definitely. Get ready for those online college courses. But the way it was run was just so terrible, especially on Zoom. I mean, just have online classes. Just be like, here's the assignment, get the reading done, turn it in. That's how online college is. My brother and I obviously attended the public school. My brother was suspended a few times. I never was. I was always on the honor roll. But yeah, my parents were obviously not fundamentalists. My mom had no patience for homeschooling, and she could have never homeschooled my brother because he was very hyper. He had behavioral problems. He was just a hyper kid, and he loved to antagonize my mom. My mom is very high-strung. My mom was also not equipped to homeschool. She had no patience. There were some great homeschooling families in our church. There were some that were awful, and the stereotypical fundamentalists and all this stuff. But there were some that were actually really great. I actually had one mom who tutored me in high school for math because I've always really struggled with math. I could read like that. 3rd grade, learned how to read. By the end of the year, I was doing college reading level. So she tutored me with math, and I was able to like pass all my And she actually had been a professor at one of the state colleges. I think it was Washington State University, but I'm not quite sure. And then I think one of their kids went to private school. The other one may have gone, the youngest one may have gone to high school like the last 2 years. And honestly, public school was only great for like seeing your friends. Our school was, it was so terrible. I never understand why people on Free Ginger and Reddit are like, oh my gosh, you know, homeschooling is terrible. They should send them to public school where they can actually get an education. It depends on where you live. They're talking about Jill Duggar sending her kids to, or her oldest son to public schools. Now, this is in Arkansas, and no offense, because I mean, rural Washington State is just as bad, but it's like, how great are the public schools in rural Arkansas? I mean, when you don't have very good funding, the schools are gonna be terrible. And it was the same way where I grew up. The people were poor, so therefore the schools were not well funded, and therefore the programs were not well funded. If you're in a wealthier community, my husband's from upstate New York, and they have very well funded schools, very great public schools, and he got a great education, lucky him. There were a lot of people I knew when I was stationed in Hawaii, for example, who homeschooled their kids because the schools were that terrible. For example, they decided to start taking Fridays off, all Fridays off, because the teachers wanted to have Aloha Friday. They're like, screw the kids. I mean, a Friday off every once in a while is great, but anyway. Thanks for watching. I'm gonna put out more videos, more episodes, I guess. I'm gonna be talking about AWANA. I'm gonna be talking about militias and white supremacy in our church. Just a few members, but I'm going to be talking about physical abuse of church members, and I'm going to be talking about a little bit of sexual abuse, fundamentalist families, and just some stories about some experiences with them that I had. I'm going to address end times discussion within the church, spiritual abuse. James Dobson focused on the family and how well intertwined that was within our church, as well as Dave Ramsey, Heritage Foundation, NRA, and then the book How to Train Up a Child, how that was introduced into our church, and also boot camps for kids with behavioral problems or showing signs of homosexuality. So we'll get into that. And then the book, Joshua Harris's book, No Kissing Until Marriage. I can't remember what the name of it was. Oh, why I kissed dating goodbye. And then discussion about cavemen in the church. Thanks for watching. See you next time.